Around 200,000 years ago, in what is now Kenya, someone arrived carrying obsidian. That sounds ordinary until you ask where the obsidian came from. Not the next hill, not the riverbank. Chemical analysis traced much of it to a volcanic source about 166 kilometers away. More than 100 miles of terrain stood between the stone and the place where archaeologists found it. And obsidian is not subtle. It is sharp, brittle, glossy, and extremely good at turning into cutting edges. It is basically volcanic glass with anger issues. The easy answer is that humans carried it because it made better tools. True. Also nowhere near enough. Who knew where the source was? Who remembered the route? Was the stone carried directly, moved during seasonal travel, or passed from one group to another? And why bring so much of it when every kilogram made walking harder? This is where a simple rock becomes evidence for a much more complicated mind. Long-distance stone transport can reveal planning, landscape knowledge, resource selection, tool maintenance, and social connection. It may even show humans treating technology as insurance carrying tomorrow's solution before tomorrow's problem appeared. So, why did humans carry stone for miles? Because sometimes survival depended on bringing the right piece of the terrain with you. The short answer is simple. Good stone made better tools. But tool is slightly misleading here because ancient humans were not always carrying a finished knife from one place to another. Often they carried a core, a carefully chosen lump of stone from which sharp flakes could be struck whenever they were needed. Think of it as a toolbox that had not been opened yet. One good core might produce several cutting edges. One flake could slice hide. Another could remove meat from bone. A fresh edge could shape wood, cut plant fibers, or replace the last one after it snapped at the worst possible moment, which is when tools traditionally choose to break. And not every rock could do this well. Some stone fractured unpredictably. Some crumbled. Some produced thick, blunt pieces that were technically edges, in the same way a broken dinner plate is technically cutlery. Materials like obsidian could form extremely sharp flakes. Other fine-grained stones offered durability, control, or a dependable fracture pattern. So carrying good stone was not the same as carrying useless weight. It was carrying potential, several future tools compressed into one object. But that creates a new problem. If the only goal was to obtain a sharp edge, why not make every tool beside the quarry and leave the heavy waste behind? Why transport cores, cobbles, or unfinished pieces across the region at all? Because the value of stone was not limited to what it could do now. Its real value may have been what it allowed you to do later, in a place where the ground offered nothing useful. Now put that core into a body. A walking human is already paying for every step with calories, heat, water, and time. Add weight, and the bill rises. The legs work harder. Balance becomes less forgiving. Long distances become more expensive. And if something with teeth appears, the rock you carefully selected does not suddenly become lighter out of respect for the emergency. Early humans were not traveling empty-handed either. They may have been carrying food, digging sticks, wooden tools, gathered plants, infants, or parts of an animal worth protecting from every carnivore with a functioning nose. Stone had to compete with all of that. So why keep it? Because a small cutting edge could unlock resources far heavier than itself. Experimental work shows that even tiny stone flakes can be remarkably effective at skinning an animal, slicing meat away from bone, and removing tough tissue around joints. A flake weighing only a few grams could help process kilograms of food. It could open hide, cut sinew, sharpen wood, and turn a carcass from a large biological problem into dinner, material, and fuel. That is an extraordinary return on weight. The useful question was not, how heavy is this rock? It was, how many future problems can this rock solve before it is exhausted? A poor stone might fail after one bad strike. A good core could keep producing fresh edges as older ones dulled or broke. Carrying it cost energy now, but arriving without it could cost the entire opportunity later. And in a world where food appeared unpredictably, predators arrived quickly, and useful stone was not guaranteed. Missing one opportunity could matter far more than sore arms. The body hated the extra luggage. Survival may have hated being unprepared even more. The conventional story goes like this. An early human finds a carcass. There is a convenient stone nearby. He hits it against another stone, produces a sharp flake, cuts the meat, and accidentally invents technology before lunch. That probably happens sometimes. The problem is that the archaeological record contains stones that were not conveniently nearby. At Nyayanga, beside Lake Victoria in Kenya, archaeologists found Oldowan tools dating back at least 2.6 million years. The toolmakers had access to local rock, but they did not simply use whatever was under their feet. They selected particular materials and carried some cobbles from sources as far as roughly 13 kilometers away before shaping them at the site. 13 kilometers may sound modest beside the obsidian that later traveled more than 100 miles. But this was happening long before Homo sapiens appeared before roads, backpacks, written maps, or anyone complaining that the quarry was a little out of the way. And the pattern matters more than one adventurous rock. The transported material appears to have been deliberately selected for toolmaking. This suggests the toolmakers were linking different parts of the region together. Stone in one place, food processing opportunities in another, and movement between them. We cannot identify exactly which hominin species carried every cobble, nor can we climb inside their minds and prove they were planning several days ahead. But the neat image of a creature simply grabbing the nearest rock no longer works. These toolmakers were choosing. They were transporting. And millions of years ago, they were already treating useful stone as something worth bringing to the problem, not merely something they hoped to find beside it. So how do archaeologists know that a black shard found at one camp began its life beside a volcano more than 100 miles away? The stone does not come with a label. Fortunately, obsidian carries something better: chemistry. Obsidian forms when silica-rich volcanic material cools so quickly that crystals have little time to grow. The result is volcanic glass. But obsidian from different geological sources does not contain exactly the same mixture of trace elements. One source may have a distinctive balance of rubidium, strontium, zirconium, iron, or other elements. Another source will have its own pattern, not a visible logo, more like a chemical accent. Researchers first collect geological samples from known obsidian outcrops. They measure their elemental composition and build reference groups. Then they analyze archaeological artifacts and compare the results. When the chemical pattern of a flake matches the pattern of a known source, the stone has effectively revealed its address. It is prehistoric provenance work conducted by forcing a rock through customs. This method is powerful because human eyes are not enough. Two pieces of obsidian can look almost identical while coming from different volcanic systems, and two pieces from the same broad source can vary enough that researchers must sample carefully and admit when a match is uncertain. But even a confident source match tells us only where the material began, not exactly how it traveled. If a source lies 166 kilometers from a site, that number usually describes geographic separation, not a preserved itinerary. The actual route may have curved around lakes, cliffs, dry country, hostile animals, or territories occupied by other groups. The stone might have moved during one long journey. It might have traveled in stages as people shifted camps. Or it might have passed through several hands before reaching the place where archaeologists found it. Chemistry can identify the volcano. It cannot identify the carrier. And that limitation is exactly what makes the evidence so interesting. A tiny shard can prove that distant places became connected. But it leaves open the larger human story: memory, movement, repeated visits, and perhaps relationships between groups. Once the stone tells us where it started, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did so much of it end up so far away? Now return to Sibilo School Road site in Kenya. The site was initially dated to at least 200,000 years ago, although later volcanic ash dating refined its age to about 222,500 years ago. Whoever visited this place was working within an early Middle Stone Age tradition. They prepared cores deliberately, controlled the shapes of the flakes they removed, and used methods associated with level I technology. And nearly half of the stone assemblage was obsidian, 43%. That is important because this was not one mysterious black flake that somehow wandered into the wrong excavation. Obsidian was a major part of the technology used at the site. Chemical sourcing connected it to at least 3 locations. One was approximately 25 kilometers away. Another was about 140 kilometers away. The third was roughly 166 kilometers to the south. Most of the sourced obsidian came from that farthest location. Now imagine what must sit behind that pattern. Perhaps people traveled directly to the source, selected material, and carried it back. Perhaps the obsidian moved as part of seasonal journeys in which groups repeatedly shifted between water, animals, plants, and familiar camps. Or perhaps no single traveler covered the entire distance. The stone may have moved through meetings, exchanges, partnerships, or overlapping territories. passing from one group to another until it reached Sibilo. The artifacts cannot tell us which version happened. They can tell us that distant places were connected. This was no longer a world in which technology depended entirely on whatever happened to be lying beside the next carcass. People had access directly or indirectly to resources spread across an enormous region. They knew enough, traveled enough, or remained connected enough to keep volcanic glass moving through it. So the 166-kilometer number does not necessarily describe one heroic quarry expedition. It describes something more consequential. A human system large enough to move stone farther than any one camp could see. So what were these transported stones probably for? First, food processing insurance. A carcass does not schedule an appointment. An animal may die beside a river, on an open plain, or in a patch of ground containing nothing sharper than disappointment. If early toolmakers arrived with suitable stone, they could cut through skin, remove flesh, separate joints, and access resources before scavengers or predators took over. At Nyayanga, researchers have proposed that transporting selected stone may have helped toolmakers anticipate food processing needs in places where useful raw material was scarce. We cannot prove that intention directly, but the pattern fits a simple strategy: bring the cutting potential to the food instead of hoping the food dies beside a quarry. Second, replacement. Stone edges dull. Flakes snap. The tool that worked perfectly 5 minutes ago can become a small, blunt betrayal halfway through the job. A core solves that problem because it is not one edge. It is a reserve of possible edges. Strike it again, and prehistoric customer support sends a replacement immediately. Third, access. Good food, water, shelter, and good stone rarely occur in one convenient location. Carrying raw material allowed hominins to move into areas that offered animals or plants but lacked suitable rock. Technology loosened the grip of local geology. That may have been the deeper advantage. A group carrying stone did not need every destination to provide everything. They could separate the place where material was collected from the place where it was used. They could arrive prepared, exploit opportunities quickly, and leave before the surroundings or something living in them became less cooperative. The stone was heavy, but it made more of the world usable. Nyayanga and Sibilo are not 2 points on a simple ladder, from primitive to advanced. They are glimpses of different human systems operating at different scales. At Nyayanga, at least 2.6 million years ago, early toolmakers carried selected stone roughly 13 kilometers. Much later, Middle Stone Age populations moved obsidian across regions measured in tens or even hundreds of kilometers. And between those examples sits Olorgesailie, in southern Kenya. Between roughly 320,000 and at least 295,000 years ago, toolmakers there were using Middle Stone Age technologies, collecting pigment and bringing in obsidian from sources outside the basin. Some material appears to have traveled over distances of roughly 25 to 50 kilometers or more. That combination matters. Smaller, more carefully prepared tools appeared alongside wider raw material movement and signs that people were using colored minerals. But it would be a mistake to arrange these discoveries into a motivational poster about humanity becoming smarter. Longer transport does not automatically mean a better brain. Distance depends on geology. A group living beside excellent stone may have no reason to carry it far. Another group may move enormous distances because food, water, and raw material are scattered across harsher terrain. The number on the map reflects opportunity, necessity, movement, and social access, not intelligence alone. What changed over time was not simply how far people could walk. Stone became integrated into increasingly broad systems of mobility. A source could be remembered, revisited, shared, or reached through other people. Different camps no longer had to function as isolated worlds. The wider world was becoming connected. And once stone could move through connections between places, the next step was almost inevitable. It could also move through connections between people. A distant stone source is useful only if someone knows it exists. That knowledge has to live somewhere. A child is not born knowing which black rock will fracture cleanly, which dull gray cobble will waste an afternoon, or which valley contains a reliable outcrop hidden beyond the next ridge. Someone has to demonstrate the difference. Someone has to remember the route. Someone has to explain when the journey is safe, where water can be found, and what material is worth carrying home. Stone transport was therefore not just a physical act, it was inherited information. At places such as Olorgesailie, Researchers have argued that the movement of obsidian across long distances may reflect increasingly broad social connections. Perhaps groups visited the sources themselves. But material could also have moved through meetings between people whose territories overlapped, with stone passing from one camp to the next. That possibility changes what the artifact represents. A core might contain cutting edges, but it could also contain a relationship. Access to distant stone may have depended on knowing another group, sharing a route, maintaining permission, or returning to the same meeting place across generations. We should not call this commerce in the modern sense. There were no prices, receipts, loyalty points, or five-star quarry reviews. And archaeology cannot usually tell us whether a particular stone was gifted, exchanged, collected directly, or simply carried during ordinary movement. But it can reveal connection. The techniques needed to choose, transport, and shape stone also had to be learned socially. Every skilled strike preserved knowledge passed from one set of hands to another. Eventually, carrying stone was no longer only about carrying material. It was carrying memory, instruction, access, and perhaps trust. And trust, unlike obsidian, becomes more valuable the farther a group travels. But connection came with dependence. Carrying good stone allowed people to travel beyond the places where suitable rock occurred. It made more environments usable. Yet the moment a group began relying on distant material, survival depended on more than knowing how to strike a core. The route had to remain open. Water had to be available along the way. Familiar landmarks had to survive floods, droughts, fires, and generations of imperfect memory. If access depended on contact with another group, that relationship had to be maintained. If people collected the stone directly, they still had to spend time and energy reaching it while avoiding cliffs, predators, injuries, and other humans who may have wanted the same resource. We cannot prove that prehistoric groups fought over particular quarries at Sibilo or Olorgesailie. But valuable resources do not remove competition simply because they are made of rock, and preparation could fail. A carefully transported core might be lost during a river crossing. It might contain hidden flaws. One bad strike could split it uselessly after days of carrying it. There was no refund. So stone technology did not eliminate uncertainty. It reorganized it. Instead of gambling entirely on finding usable material at the next destination, people invested energy in roots, knowledge, objects, and relationships before they knew exactly when those investments would pay off. That was powerful. It was also fragile. The more survival depended on a network of remembered places and cooperating people, the more dangerous it became when climate changed, routes disappeared, or connections broke. Technology gave early humans freedom from the stone beneath their feet, but it tied them to a much larger world. So why did humans carry stone for miles? Here is what we know. At sites separated by immense stretches of time, archaeologists have found stone that did not originate nearby. Early toolmakers selected particular materials and moved them across wide regions. Much later, Middle Stone Age populations transported obsidian over distances reaching well beyond 100 kilometers. That part is not speculation. The stronger inference is that these people understood differences in stone quality and incorporated raw material into the way they moved, gathered food, and prepared for future tasks. They were not always waiting for a problem and then searching the ground for a solution. Sometimes, they brought the solution with them. Beyond that, the evidence becomes less tidy. Some stone may have been collected directly. Some may have traveled during seasonal movements. Some may have passed between groups. Distant material could reflect cooperation, exchange, shared territory, or simply repeated journeys across familiar terrain. We usually cannot know which person carried a particular core, how many stages it traveled, or what that person believed they were doing. But the central answer is clear. Humans carried stone because the right material was worth more than its weight. It could become fresh edges, replacement tools, processed food, shaped wood, and access to places where useful rock was absent. They were not carrying a useless object. They were carrying options. A stone in the hand meant that when the surroundings presented a problem, the same surroundings did not also have to provide the answer. Look at what you carry when you leave home. A phone, a charger, water, medicine, a jacket you may not wear, a tool you may not use. Most of it is not for the present. It is for the moment when the present stops cooperating. That is the same logic hidden inside a prehistoric core. The person carrying obsidian across Kenya was not carrying one finished answer. They were carrying a reserve of possible answers: a fresh edge for meat, a replacement after breakage, a tool for wood, hide, fiber, or some problem that had not happened yet. We still do this because uncertainty has weight. Sometimes it weighs a power bank, sometimes a first aid kit, sometimes a lump of volcanic glass with anger issues that has already crossed 166 kilometers before breakfast. The difference is that modern equipment comes from shops, factories, roads, and delivery networks. Ancient humans had to build the network themselves out of memory, movement, teaching, and trust. By carrying stone, they made survival less dependent on whatever happened to be lying under their feet. They took one useful part of the world around them and made it portable. And that may be the deeper reason humans carried stone for miles. Not because they loved rocks, because carrying stone allowed them to bring part of tomorrow's solution with them. Apparently, the first thing humanity ever packed for a long trip was a rock.